Today in AP Comparative Government, we're going to be talking about two key terms, legitimacy and stability. Legitimacy is one of those cornerstone terms that you just have to understand if you're going to do well on the AP test. So let's talk about it for a second. Well, the good news is that legitimacy in and of itself is a really easy concept to understand. Legitimacy is defined as the right to rule. Now, that's different from the ability to rule, by the way. The right to rule. Now, legitimacy can be secured in a number of different ways. Different countries use social compacts, constitutions, and even ideologies to confer legitimacy. Countries that don't have a clear policy direction often don't have it because they lack legitimacy. That is, their government is perceived as not having the right to rule. And that can be for a number of reasons that we will talk about. But let's talk about the three types of legitimacy that are traditionally recognized. In this case, I'm talking about traditional, charismatic, and rational based legitimacy. Traditional legitimacy is the belief that tradition should determine who rules and how they rule. This is stuff like kings and queens. The Tudor dynasty in England ruled England for about 100 years. And the idea was, by tradition, whoever inherits the throne, that is, whoever's the firstborn and subsequent, has the right to rule. It's based on tradition. But this can also be based in a theocracy, in a religious oriented government. For example, Iran's government bases its legitimacy in part on the ability to interpret Sharia law, which is Islamic law. And I should mention at the outset that these are not mutually exclusive terms. You can have traditional legitimacy that's also charismatic and may also contain a component of rational legal. So they're not mutually exclusive. Make sure that you understand that. Number two, charismatic legitimacy, I think, is just the easiest to understand. This is when the legitimacy of the government is simply centered around the personality of an individual or a small group. For example, during the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte stepped into a vacuum of political leadership and through charismatic leadership was able to confer legitimacy on what essentially turned into a new monarchy, even though that was exactly what the French Revolution sought to eliminate. The last one is rational legal legitimacy. This is legitimacy based on a system of well established laws and procedures. It's very institutionalized. That is, it's dependent on things like legislatures or the judiciary. A good example of this would be Parliament in Great Britain. People believe in the right to rule in this case, not because of the person, but because of the rules that brought them into office. Now, there's a couple components of rational, legal based legitimacy, because when we talk about the law, we're usually talking about two different types of law: common law and code law. Common law is based on tradition, past rulings, and the interpretation of statutes. It's very organic, and judges change it depending upon their perspectives on the law. A great example of this would be decisions issued by the United States Supreme Court. Rulings on issues like gay marriage and women's reproductive rights, these can change over time based on the interpretation of an existing law, in our case, the Constitution. The biggest examples of common law traditions are Great Britain and the United States. Code law, on the other hand, is based on a comprehensive system of written rules or codes. So in common law, judges tend to make interpretations, and those interpretations gain the actual force of law. That doesn't happen in code law. There may still be interpretations, but a judge's decision doesn't change the law. It's not organic. It's very fixed. European nations like France use code law. And this includes, from our list of 6 nations, China, Mexico, and Russia. Most countries today find their legitimacy based on rational legal grounds. Though, of course, there are still some combinations. For example, Great Britain still maintains a monarchy, and this also adds traditional legitimacy to the regime. Now, let's talk about factors that tend to encourage legitimacy. And for each one of these factors, you can flip it to the negative. So when it's positive, it's encouraging legitimacy. But when it's negative, or when it's not there, then it has a tendency to harm legitimacy. Economic well being is what I talked about in a previous lecture, where it's very difficult nowadays to divorce the political system from the economic system that a country follows. Citizens tend to credit their government for economic prosperity and blame it for economic hardship, whether or not that's deserved. Number 2, historical tradition. I think this one's pretty self-explanatory. The longer the government has been in place, the more likely citizens are to view it as legitimate. Likewise, number 3, charismatic leadership is pretty obvious. If you have a charismatic leader, someone with an engaging personality, then you are more likely to perceive that regime as legitimate. Whereas a leader who is not charismatic is going to be fighting an uphill battle. Now, number 4 is interesting. This has a lot to do with people identifying with the nation more than the state. So remember, the nation is an area in which people have a shared cultural tradition. And nationalism is a belief in that culture. Russia is a great example of this today. Vladimir Putin, as I'm speaking here in the late summer of 2023, places a lot of his legitimacy on the idea of a shared cultural tradition that is traditional Russia and sometimes maybe even allusions to the Soviet Union. So it's a nationalist based legitimacy. And then number 5 is once more, I think, a little obvious. If the government gives you something good, you're going to be much more likely to support it and to see that government as legitimate. If the government doesn't give you anything good, then you're much, much less likely to consider it to be a legitimate government. So, like I said, with all 5 factors, they can be both positive and negative. And there can be a mix, just like there can be a mix of the 3 different types of legitimacy.